All right, guys, welcome back. This is the SOL 6 lecture, and we start with the first political party. So let's take a look. So there were some issues following the constitutional period that led to the formation of the first political parties. All right, remember a political party is a group of people with differing views on how to manage different aspects of our society. So what led to the development of the first political parties are differing views on economic policy. These are policies about how to manage the economy, and differing views on foreign policy. So how to deal with foreign countries, namely Britain and France in this case. The first issue that led to the formation of political parties is the national bank. So remember, Federalists are about a strong national government, and Hamilton and the Federalists wanted a national bank. They thought a national bank would strengthen and grow the economy. So they wanted more government involvement in the economy. Thomas Jefferson did not like that idea. He said that a national bank was not a power of the federal government. So Jefferson doesn't like this. All right, another issue is a foreign policy issue. And this is the Jay Treaty. The Jay Treaty was with Britain. Okay. And something that you're going to see is the Federalists tend to be a little pro-British, okay? They represent bankers and business interests in the Northeast that do a lot of business with Britain. So they're kind of friendly with the British. So they signed the Jay Treaty, and the Jay Treaty settles some trade and boundary disputes between the U.S. and Britain, all right? And then in exchange, Britain says, okay, well, we'll abandon some forts and retreat to this predetermined, boundary line. And Hamilton likes this, right? This is going to kind of improve relations with the British, facilitate more trade with the British. But Jefferson and his followers see it as too pro-British. So in summary, Jefferson says the Jay Treaty gives up too much to the British. It's too friendly to the British. So this is a foreign policy disagreement. And then the undeclared war on France. France has been sinking American ships that are trading with French enemies, namely Britain. All right, and remember the Federalists are pro-British. So John Adams and the Federalists are kind of waging an undeclared naval war on France. They're fighting the French. Hamilton and the Federalists support the war against France. Jefferson didn't. He did not support the war against France. Okay. So this leads to the formation of our first two real political parties. And you're going to see their beliefs can kind of reflect that Federalist versus anti-Federalist sentiment that we talked about during the constitutional era. Sort of strong national government versus weak national government and states' rights. So let's look at the Federalists. The Federalists are led by John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. They favor a strong national government and a commercial economy. A commercial economy is an economy based on commerce. It's based on trade and business. They're supported by bankers and business interests in the Northeast. Okay. The Democratic Republicans are the party formed by Thomas Jefferson. They're led by Jefferson and Madison. They prefer a weak national government, more states' rights, and an agricultural or agrarian economy. They are supported by farmers and artisans and frontier settlers in the South. So the election of 1800, the presidential election of 1800 rolls around, and Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republican Party beat John Adams and the Federalists. And this is the first time in American political history where one party loses, another party wins, and the losing party has to give up power. So imagine you have all this power, now you have to willingly give it up to people who you are completely opposed to. So, it's almost like, hey, is this really going to happen? Are they really going to yield power to the Democratic Republicans? And they do. It's the first time power is transferred peacefully from one political party to another. And we've been kind of doing it ever since. And it's really kind of the peaceful transfer of power is one of the key parts of our democracy. It's very important. All right. So let's look at expansion of the early United States. So the United States, after the American Revolution, is going to start to expand its territory. All right, we need to talk about this a little bit. I always like to show students this painting. This is American Progress by John Gass. Okay, and this is written in the late 1800s. And I want to point some things out here. So first of all, this lady right here, this kind of spectral kind of flying lady right here, represents American progress. All right, and let's take a look at a few things. All right, first of all, what she got stringing out there behind her? That's a telegraph line. Okay, so she's stringing a telegraph line behind her as she goes. You'll note the railroads that are following her. See the pioneers that are following her. All these different folks, and so she's got presumably. I used to think this was the Bible, but it's something else. I think it's represents civilization or something like that. But anyway, you can tell John Gass is saying she's bringing modern technology and modern transportation. She's bringing civilization with her, right? And look at this. If I draw a line across this part of the painting, you'll notice that this part of the painting is dark and this part of the painting is light. And so Gass is saying that American progress is dispelling the darkness, right? Bringing civilization to the untamed wilderness. And if you notice a little bit of sarcasm in my voice, that's intentional. Okay? Look at what else is going on here. Who are these folks? They're Native Americans. And it looks to me like they're running for their lives. Native Americans are going to be virtually wiped out as a result of this expansion. 95% of the Native Americans that were here when Europeans arrived are going to be gone in just a few generations. Basically what happens is we sign a treaty with the Native Americans and we say, okay, all the land to the west is yours forever, to be undisturbed forever. But then we find gold or we find farmland on that land that we promised to them. So we violate the treaty. We break our promise to them and we write a new one. And this becomes a vicious cycle of attacking and killing Native Americans and pushing them off their land. And it's a really ugly thing. You also see that the buffalo, basically the natural world, see the bear down here. So Mother Nature is also fleeing for its life in the face of American progress, right? So this whole idea of American progress, it's not all, hey, westward expansion and the spread of civilization. There's a very dark side to it as well. You'll note the term manifest destiny up here. Manifest destiny is a term people used back then. It basically means it's the destiny of the United States to stretch from east to west, from Atlantic to Pacific Ocean. So remember that term, manifest destiny, that it was our right to expand from Atlantic to Pacific, from east to west coast. All right, why did people go west? Well, for the same reasons they came to the New World in the first place. Cheap land, to farm, and to mine. Settlers moved from the east out to the Midwest. They moved to the southwestern United States. They went to Texas in large numbers. All right, following behind them are railroad networks and canals, and this is really important, okay? Those railroads and those canals are going to take raw materials, corn, beef, copper, tin, lead, from the west and ship it back east, where those factories in the east are going to turn it into products, and then it's going to be sold on the world markets, and that is really going to just grow the American economy very rapidly in the latter half of the 19th century. Okay. All right. The first major expansion of the United States occurs with the Louisiana Purchase. In the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson purchases the Louisiana Territory. That's this territory right here. He purchases it from Napoleon. Napoleon needed money. He's fighting an awfully big war in Europe against lots of European countries, okay? And so he sold this French territory to Jefferson for $15 million. Works out to about 3 cents an acre. It's the biggest real estate deal in history. It's a pretty good deal, arguably. All right. It doubles the size of the United States overnight. The United States also now has control of the Mississippi River and access to the very valuable port in New Orleans, and you can just use that port to ship goods up and down the Mississippi River out into the Gulf of Mexico and out to world markets. So it's a really big deal. The territory is explored by the Lewis and Clark expedition. Lewis and Clark explore the Louisiana Territory, they map it, they catalog its wildlife. They could not have done it without the help of Sacagawea. Sacagawea, their Native American guide, acts as an intermediary between the explorers and the Native American groups that they encounter. She knows the territory and helps them, find their way around, keeps them from getting lost. At one point, the canoe actually capsizes, and they almost lose all of their very valuable maps and papers and things that they've been cataloging, and she saves it all. So Sacagawea is an indispensable part of this expedition. All right, let's take a look at a couple other examples of U.S. expansion. One of them is the Texas annexation. All right, so Texas was a province of Mexico. It belonged to Mexico. And Americans started to settle there. All right, and after a while, they demanded independence from Mexico. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? All right. Mexico, of course, did not want this to happen. And so they sent an army up under the command of General Santa Anna to put down the Texan revolt. All right. And one of the most famous episodes of the Texas War for Independence is the Battle of the Alamo. The Alamo, which is pictured here, was a Spanish mission. There's a fort built for missionaries back in the 1500s to convert local Native Americans to Catholicism. Well, it ends up becoming the site of the last stand of this small band of Texans who said, we're going to hold off against the Mexican army and allow the rest of the Texan army to sort of pull back under the command of Sam Houston. So you've got Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett and a few hundred kind of defenders inside of this Spanish mission, and they fight the much larger Mexican force and manage to hold off the Mexican army under Santa Anna for 2 weeks. And so they end up fighting and dying to the last man. But the Alamo becomes a rallying cry for Texas independence. People say, remember the Alamo, and because of the Alamo, many Americans support Texas independence. Texas wins its independence at this battle here. This is the Battle of San Jacinto. It's on April 21st, which is a day before my birthday, by the way. April 21st, 1836. All right. So under the command of Sam Houston, the Texan army retreated north. They kept going north and north and north. And so Santa Anna's Mexican army had to follow them north. And what Sam Houston was trying to do is stretch out Santa Anna's supply lines a little bit. It's pretty smart, right? Well, anyway, both of the armies sort of settled down on the San Jacinto Plain and kind of engage in a little you go first kind of game. Well, Sam Houston eventually decides to take the initiative and march on the Mexican army. Well, a funny thing happens. So the Texan troops under Santa Anna advance across the plain of San Jacinto, but because of the topography, because of the layout of the land, the Mexican army doesn't see them until it's too late. So basically, both armies were encamped. The Mexican army wasn't expecting the attack, and the Texan army was able to get within a very close distance before the Mexicans realized they were there. The Texans pour fire into the Mexican camp and just send it into total disarray. The battle is a complete rout. The Texan army wins, and Texas wins its independence in 1836. Now, an interesting thing is Texas is going to stay an independent republic for 9 years. It's not going to become part of the United States until 1845. When it does, that's going to make Mexico very angry. All right. The other major territorial acquisition that we need to talk about is the Mexican cession. This word right here, cession, if you cede something you sign it over to somebody. So if I cede land to somebody, I'm signing it over to them. We went to war with Mexico. We sort of provoked a war with Mexico, actually. President Polk sent the army down to the Rio Grande to deliberately provoke a war with Mexico so that we could get this territory. We won the war with Mexico in 1848, and the Mexican cession is a land area larger than all of Western Europe. It includes California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of Colorado and New Mexico. It's a major territorial acquisition. All right, there's the Battle of San Jacinto again. How are Native Americans affected by all of this? They lose their tribal lands. They're wiped out in violent conflicts with both settlers and soldiers, and they're forcibly relocated to reservations over and over and over again. One of the most tragic episodes is the Trail of Tears. This is by Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson ordered the forcible relocation of Native American tribes from the Atlantic coast to reservation lands in Oklahoma. Thousands of Cherokee Indians died on this forced march. Imagine very young and very old people forced to walk from here to Oklahoma. How many of them are going to survive, right? And so this is a very a stain sort of on American history. It's a very tragic episode. All right, let's talk a little bit about the War of 1812. This is sort of round two with the British. Okay, the British are going to, invade and win a series of battles. Ultimately, will win at New Orleans, and it'll all be over. All right, so anyway, all right, one of the main causes of the War of 1812 is British impressment of American sailors. Impressment means they were taking sailors off our ships and making them work on their ships. You can see why that would make people mad. So they're impressing our sailors into service. Okay? And so the War of 1812, it's between the United States and Great Britain. Remember that British interference with American shipping or impressment is an issue. Also, we wanted to go west, and the British were out there on the frontier. They were inciting Native Americans to attack our westward settlers. And so a desire for westward expansion is also going to be a cause of the War of 1812. The Federalists were opposed to the War of 1812. They opposed Madison's declaration of war. They held a convention. It was called the Hartford Convention. They threatened to secede, and they proposed constitutional amendments, all because of this war. They were totally against it. By the way, if you look at this picture over here, this is the White House, which was burned by the British during the War of 1812. Okay, this weird little thing that you see up here. That's a terrible arrow. This weird little thing that you see right here is a lightning rod that's on the top of it. But anyway, all right. So the British are going to attempt a three-pronged attack. Okay, basically a three-pronged invasion. This one right here is where they end up just burning the White House. By the way, it's during this particular aspect of the campaign that there is a battle at Fort McHenry, and that is where T writes the Star Spangled Banner, the national anthem. Okay, and then the real critical battle, the one that a lot of people talk about when it comes to War of 1812, is the Battle of New Orleans, and this is that southern prong of that British three-pronged attack. So the British are invading, they're marching on New Orleans, right? And Andrew Jackson is sent down there to take command of American forces. And he uses this kind of canal ditch type thing to build a fortified line. So his troops are dug in to this canal. So they're behind cover. They have artillery. They have their guns all kind of pointed out. So they've got this heavily fortified defensive line. So, this is a pretty formidable defense, and the British plan of attack is less than creative. It's a full frontal assault. So they're just going to attack head on. And I know what you're thinking. That seems dumb, right? Like, why would you do that? You're just going to get mowed down. They were cocky. They really thought that the American troops were just going to scatter, and they said, when they see us coming and they see this well-disciplined, highly trained army, they're just going to drop their guns and run. That's not what happened, right? And here's the thing. Those American troops had weapons like this. So their cannons had grape shot, basically turning the cannons into giant shotguns. The British march shoulder to shoulder in neat little rows on this entrenchment, and they just get obliterated. Andrew Jackson, because of his command of these forces, becomes a national war hero, and that's going to help him get the White House later on. All right, War of 1812 results. We get claim to the Oregon Territory, so we agree with the British that the 49th parallel is our northern boundary, and that gives us claim to the Oregon Territory. And we're going to see more settlers go west and go down to Florida. Later on, we'll buy Florida from Spain in 1819. So we acquire Florida from Spain in 1819. So we can see increased immigration west and down to Florida. Another effect of the War of 1812 is the Federalists are viewed as unpatriotic. Remember, they didn't support the war. They had their Hartford Convention. They said they were going to secede and amend the Constitution. The political party, the Federalist Party, dies out after the War of 1812. During the War of 1812, many enslaved African Americans escaped to British lines and secured their freedom. Many thousands of them were resettled in Canada. And so there were some settlements there. They were allowed to own property and vote. They had many rights in Canada that they did not have in the United States. Also, after the War of 1812, we start to build coastal defenses, because remember I said the British were basically able to use their navy to land troops and raid our coastline at will. That's how they burned the White House. So we're like, we need coastal defenses. And one of those coastal defenses you guys live very close to is Fort Monroe. So this used to be a major coastal battery, an artillery battery, that would defend the Hampton Roads area against naval attacks. In this case, they were thinking of the British. All right. The economic impact of the War of 1812 is dramatic. Our market economy is going to grow rapidly after the War of 1812. We're going to see transportation improvements, such as canals and railroads. We're going to see agricultural improvements, such as the cotton gin and the mechanical reaper. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a second. We're going to see industrial innovations like textile mills. A textile mill is a factory that makes cloth. We're going to see communication improvements like the telegraph. And I'll explain the telegraph a little bit more in a moment too. Many of these internal improvements are funded by something called the American system. The American system said basically what we're going to do is we're going to tax foreign products. So if a foreign company makes a product, we'll tax them. That's called a tariff. A tariff is a tax on foreign goods. And we'll use the money from those tariffs to fund internal improvements to grow the U.S. economy. All right, we'll talk a little bit about tariffs as we go through the course. It seems like it makes sense. If you tax foreign goods, you protect domestic industries. What ends up happening is it makes products more expensive, and a lot of times it initiates something called a trade war. More on that later. So the American system is a plan for the economy that included tariffs, money for improvements such as canals and railroads and telegraph lines, and a national bank. All right, this is the cotton gin. It's invented by Eli Whitney, all right, and it's used to process raw cotton. Cotton harvesting is labor intensive. By turning to cotton, the slave system in the American South is going to grow exponentially. And it has a lot to do with this machine. So it's pretty simple. Basically, there's a comb inside of this thing, and the cotton has all these seed pods and little bowls and things in it that you have to remove before you can turn the cotton into cloth. Okay? And they used to have to do that by hand, and it used to take lots of people hours and hours and hours just to take the stuff out of this cotton. Well, basically all you do is you stuff the raw cotton into this thing, you turn this crank here, and it pulls the raw cotton through this comb that removes all that stuff very rapidly. A couple of people can do what used to take many, many hours in much more time. This machine is going to make cotton super profitable. And the consequence of that is that in the Deep South, cotton production, cotton plantations are just going to grow like crazy. And that means that there is going to be a greater reliance on slavery. So cotton is going to drive the growth of slavery, which is going to further divide our nation and cause untold suffering for 4.5 million men, women, and children, and eventually lead to civil war. All right, here is the mechanical reaper. And you guys, because of where we live in Middlesex, you see these sorts of machines all the time, right? Machines that harvest crops. All right, this used to have to be done by a person with a scythe, basically a blade, who would cut the crops down, cut the wheat, carry it out, all done by hand. Now, one person can do the work of many, many people with this machine. This is very important. All right, now one farmer can feed 1,000 people, right? Or maybe one farmer can feed 100 people. Okay, that is really important, because now all of those people don't have to be engaged in farming. They can go work in factories. So in order to have an industrial revolution, you have to have an agricultural revolution. The agricultural revolution, machines, mechanized agriculture, allow for an industrial revolution and the growth of factories and modern society, the modern world. So you cannot have an industrial revolution without an agricultural revolution. Okay, let's take a look at the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is foreign policy. A doctrine, all right, is it's an idea, a way of doing things. And the Monroe Doctrine is foreign policy directed at Europe. So after the War of 1812, Britain and the U.S. agreed that U.S. territory extended to the edge of the Louisiana Purchase, north to the 49th parallel. That's our current border with Canada. Remember, we purchased Florida from Spain in 1819. The U.S. acquired the Oregon Territory from Britain in 1846. So now we stretch from the east to the west coast. Now we are the dominant power in the Americas. And we don't want European influence in the Americas. We want to be the big guy on the block. We don't want Europe messing around in South America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. We want them out. All right, and so this is where we come up with the Monroe Doctrine, which is our foreign policy toward Europe. A doctrine is a policy, it's a standard way of doing things. The Monroe Doctrine was created in 1823. All right, so it's created by President Monroe in response to European interference in the Americas. It has 4 parts. Let's take a look. All right, 1, the American continents should not be considered for future colonization by any European powers. Europe, stay out. Stay out of the Americas. Number 2, nations in the Western Hemisphere are different. We are republics. We elect our leaders. We don't have kings and queens, and we don't want them. Keep your kings and queens in Europe. The Americas are different than Europe. 3, the U.S. will regard as a threat any attempt by European powers to mess with the Americas. So basically what we're saying is, if you mess with the Americas, it's war, or if Europe messes with Americas, it's red, white, and blue. Okay. And number 4, the U.S. will not interfere in European affairs if Europe doesn't interfere in American affairs. You ever hear the phrase, good fences make good neighbors? If you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. Okay, and there you go. All right, that's the Monroe Doctrine. Let's take a look at the Jacksonian era. Andrew Jackson, the president at the time. Remember, he's that war hero of the Battle of New Orleans. And the Jacksonian period, the age of Jackson, is also known as the age of the common man. And I'll explain why. He's the first president to veto something. Remember when I talked about checks and balances? If Congress makes a law, the president can veto it and kick it back to Congress, and then they have to pass it with a stronger vote. So like 3/4 instead of 2/3, something like that. All right. In this case, he vetoes the national bank. He did not like the Bank of the United States, so he vetoes it, and it dies on the floor of Congress. Jackson eventually kills the bank. All right. Political parties during the Jacksonian era. You've got the Democratic Republican Party, which just becomes the Democratic Party led by Jackson. All right, the Federalist Party is gone, and it's replaced by two opposition parties. You have the Whigs, led by Henry Clay, all right, and then you have the Know Nothing Party. The Know Nothing Party was a nativist party. They were anti-immigrant, all right. And the reason they called them the Know Nothing Party is because they started off as a secret organization. If you asked them about it, they would say, I know nothing. They're nativist, they're an anti-immigrant party. All right, see, this is a political cartoon produced by the Know Nothings, right? And you can see, look how they're portraying Irish people and German people, because those are the principal immigrants at the time. They're saying, oh, look, these Irish and Germans are drunk and they're causing all sorts of problems. And look, what are they carrying? The ballot box. So they're voting, and basically they're just portraying them in very negative, stereotypical ways. If this seems familiar, it should, because this is still the attitude that we have toward immigrants. Like, there's a lot of negativity and a lot of stereotypes that are applied to immigrants. Americans have a love-hate relationship with immigration. They love the stories of their ancestors coming here and facing adversity and building a new life in the new world. They are less in love with the immigration going on at the same time. It's important to remember that at some point we were all, with the exception of Native Americans, immigrants here, and not to judge people. Okay, all right. So the age of the common man, it's called that because there's more voting. Okay, and we're expanding west. All right, and there are some sectional interests that are involved in that. You have people who are very interested in seeing slavery spread west, and people who really, really do not want to see slavery spread west. So because of all this interest, more people are going to want to vote at the same time that more people are going to get the ability to vote. So the age is characterized by equality in the political process for adult white males. Under Jackson, all white males will be able to vote. It used to be you had to be a property owner. So in a lot of places you had to own property to vote. That's going to go away. And basically all you'll have to be to vote is white and male. Hey, guess what, guys? That's still a minority of the population. Half the population is female. African Americans and many other minority groups are still not going to be able to vote. So even though this is called the age of the common man, we'll put some quotes on that, because guess what? Still, most people couldn't vote. All right, we're going to see a rise of interest groups, all right, including nativists. Nativists are anti-immigrant. It's kind of ironic because guess what? None of these people that were nativists were actually natives here, okay? They were all people who immigrated, whose ancestors came here at some point or another. So it's sort of silly when you think about it. Hey, we're the old immigrants and we somehow have more right to this land than the new immigrants. It doesn't make sense. All right. There's a changing style of campaigning. Because more people can vote, presidents are going to have to do like they do today. They're going to have to hit the campaign trail. They're going to have to make speeches to crowds of regular people like you and me. They're going to have to kiss babies and shake hands. So we see the birth of the modern style of presidential campaigns. And we also see the spoil system. When you think of the spoil system, think to the victor go the spoils. Spoils, this word right here, spoils, doesn't mean like it's all bad. Spoils. Have you ever heard the phrase spoils of war? Spoils means rewards. So it's the reward system, the spoil system. What are the rewards? The rewards are offices. So basically, Andrew Jackson introduces the spoil system, and if you support him as president, if you're one of his big supporters, when he goes to the White House, you get one of those high offices in his cabinet. Maybe you're going to become the Secretary of State or the Secretary of the Treasury. You're going to get appointed to a very high office for supporting him. He won And so he's going to reward his supporters with offices. That's the spoil system. Jackson's opponents called him King Andrew. They said that he was a tyrant. They said that his use of the veto power, remember, he's the first president to use the veto. They said he was acting like a king. Okay? The spoil system, remember, that's a reward system. He rewarded his supporters with offices. It used to be you had the same people in those same cabinet seats. You would have the same Secretary of the Treasury through several presidents. Well, Jackson said, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to challenge the political elite. We're going to get rid of those old office holders. And to the victor go the spoils. To the victor go the rewards. Universal manhood suffrage, all right, means that the religious and property qualifications are eliminated. You don't have to own property or be a specific religion to vote anymore. Now you just have to be white and male, which is kind of crazy. Like, this says universal manhood suffrage. It's not very universal, is it? Not even all men could vote. Many men could not vote, and no women could vote. So even though democracy is expanding under Jackson, it's only expanding for a set of people. We're also going to see nominating conventions. This is where delegates from the states are going to choose the candidates for president. That's like we do that today instead of the party bosses. So it used to be Congress would just choose the presidential candidates. They'd say, okay, America, here's your candidate for president. Now we're going to get more say, or at least delegates from the states are going to get more say as to who the candidates for president are. All right. Women's rights are going to start to advance during this period. And you've probably heard of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They are women's rights activists. They have a convention. It's called the Seneca Falls Convention in New York, and from it they issue the Seneca Falls Declaration. And Stanton and Anthony and the women at the Seneca Falls Convention say that women want equal rights, including the right to vote. This is very important. This is in 1848. Women aren't going to get the right to vote until 1920. Stanton and Anthony lead the women's rights movement before and after the Civil War. This is what opponents of women's right to vote had to say. They said, this is what will happen to the American family if women could vote. Look, this poor guy right here, his wife has the right to vote, and so look, the children are not cared for, and the house is a mess. He's trying to cook and do all these things at once. This is what will happen if women get the right to vote, right? It's kind of crazy enough. All right, so during this time, we also see the abolitionist movement begin to pick up momentum. The abolitionist movement is the movement to abolish slavery. It's an anti-slavery movement. There's a growing call to end slavery. And here's the thing. It's a call to end slavery based on moral arguments. More and more people are saying slavery is evil. It's morally wrong. It's against the Bible. It's inhumane. A big kind of push for this is a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe writes this book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it is a kind of a raw depiction of the horrors of slavery. You got to imagine, if you live in the North, you probably have never seen slavery firsthand. It's very distant. And so it's easy for people to kind of be indifferent. But this book was a bestseller. Lots of people read it, and they were shocked at the evils of slavery, at the separation of families, at the torture and mutilation, at all the terrible things that were happening. And so people read this book, and it made them really care about abolishing slavery. You also had abolitionist newspapers, like The Liberator, which was produced by William Lloyd Garrison, and it would feature stories about the horrors of slavery, about the murder and the rape and the mutilation and the terrible things that were happening in the South. And it made a lot of people get on board that abolitionist movement. All right, let's look at building tension prior to the Civil War. All right, There are sectional, and when we say sectional, this word right here, when we talk about the sections, we're talking about north and south. Okay, sectional tensions between north and south. All right, there are 4 areas of tension. All right, but guess what? You can break it down like this if you want, but it all comes down to this. You've got tariffs, taxes on foreign goods. The North liked tariffs, the South didn't. Why? Because the North produced things, and so they liked the tariffs because that's a tax on foreign goods and it protects them from foreign competitors, but it makes things more expensive, which the South didn't like because they didn't have a manufacturing economy. Why? Because they were totally reliant on plantation agriculture and slave labor. Okay? That's why there was no skilled middle class in the South, because all of the skilled workers were enslaved people. All right? The power of the states to override federal law is going to be an aspect of tension. All right? And westward expansion are those territories that, you remember we talked about the Louisiana Purchase, we talked about Texas and the Mexican Cession, the Oregon Territory. Are they going to be free states or slave states? Okay, and that's going to be a major point of tension. Tariffs are taxes on foreign goods. The North wanted tariffs to protect American businesses. The Southern economy was based on slave labor and plantation agriculture, so they didn't like tariffs because they made things more expensive. Note that slavery is the issue here, okay? All right, disagreements over slavery. Slave revolts in the South caused a lot of fear among Southerners. The North was opposed to slavery, all right? And so this is becoming increasingly a point of division. All right, remember that abolitionist movement is growing. There's a couple slave revolts you guys need to know about. They both happened here in Virginia. Gabriel Prosser, okay, Gabriel Prosser planned a massive slave revolt. He had many, many people prepared to seize Richmond. They had weapons hidden away, but there was a thunderstorm, and that delayed the revolt, and a couple of people got nervous, they got scared, and they sort of told somebody about the plan, and so Gabriel Prosser and his lieutenants were captured and executed. Nat Turner led a slave revolt as well, and it was, Nat Turner was a preacher, an avid reader of the Bible. He believed that his purpose was to deliver his people from slavery, and so he led this very, very violent, bloody slave revolt, right down the road on the Eastern Shore. And after it was over, he went into hiding, and he was actually hiding nearby, but people were just terrified. They were convinced that he had disappeared into the Great Dismal Swamp, and that he was going to come out with a giant army of escaped slaves and lay waste to the South. Fear of slave revolt is just going to keep the people of the South terror-stricken, so that even during the Civil War, they're going to be reluctant to send their fighting men to the front because they're afraid their slaves are going to rebel. All right, so white Southern fears about slave rebellions are increasing during this time period. This leads to a harsh law called the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed Southerners to search for escaped slaves in the North. Here's the thing. According to the Fugitive Slave Act, like, let's say you live in like Boston and you hate slavery and you're opposed to it and you're an abolitionist. According to the Fugitive Slave Act, you could be deputized and forced to help return escaped slaves to slavery. So you can imagine how this is going to upset people and increase tension between North and South. It pits owners of slaves against outraged Northerners who opposed returning slaves to bondage. Okay, another major issue is the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was a slave, but he lived free for years, so he sued for his freedom. Many enslaved people had successfully done this prior to Dred Scott, so he had pretty good reason to believe that it could work. Well, it went all the way to the Supreme Court. This was Sanford v. Scott. That's the name of the Supreme Court case. And this Supreme Court case is going to have major ramifications. The Supreme Court ruled that slaves and former slaves could not be American citizens. So not only could they not sue, they could not own property, they could not vote. Okay, they had no rights as citizens. They also ruled that the federal government had no authority to regulate slavery in the territories. That's going to be a major issue down the road. We're going to talk about some efforts to regulate slavery in the territories. All right, this case throws all that right out of the window. All right, abolitionists in the South were intimidated into silence. They were there, but if you were an abolitionist in the South, you could be charged with inciting servile insurrection. You could be charged with encouraging the slaves to revolt. They'd throw you in jail, maybe even execute you. In the North, there is a strong abolitionist movement led by people like Frederick Douglass. William Lloyd Garrison is a major leader of the abolitionist movement in the South, in the North as well. He viewed slavery as a violation of Christianity and argued for abolition. Remember, his newspaper is The Liberator. All right, Southerners are freaking out about this. They are more and more alarmed by Northern opposition to slavery. Don't forget about that book, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, that encouraged so many people to join the abolitionist movement. All right, so westward expansion, like I said, westward expansion is going to push this issue of slavery to the front of national politics. As we acquire territory, those territories have to be converted into states. And the big question is, are they going to be free states or slave states? Why does that matter? If it's a free state, that means free state senators in the Senate and free state representatives in the House of Representatives. So what's actually at stake here is who's going to control the country, pro-slavery or anti-slavery people. All right, let's take a look. All right, so the U.S. continues to expand westward. Like I said, James K. Polk ran on the Manifest Destiny platform. He ran on the idea that it was the destiny of the United States to expand from east to west coast. Under his presidency, we acquired the Oregon Territory from Britain. All right, and we won the war with Mexico and got the Mexican Cession. Remember that entire section of the Southwest. As these territories become states, the question is, will they be free states or slave states? The answer to that question will determine who controls Congress and therefore the nation. All right, this is going to be a major point of division. All right, so because of this, they're going to try to compromise 3 times over slavery in the territories. The first compromise has to do with the Louisiana Purchase. Remember the Louisiana Purchase? We bought it from Napoleon in 1803. Now it's 1820. And the question is it going to be free or slave? So they draw a line across the Louisiana Purchase. This is the 36-30 line. All right? And what they say is north of the line is free except Missouri. Missouri will be a slave state. That's Missouri right there. So even though it's north of the line, it's going to be, because they're trying to balance power in Congress. Okay? South of the line are slave states. All right? And so that is going to be the first compromise. That's the Missouri Compromise in 1820. The second compromise comes in 1850, and this has to do with the Mexican Cession. All right? And so the thing is, with the Compromise of 1850, it's over the Southwest, and so there's not a lot of people that are really interested in taking slaves to the Southwest because it's not really a good place to practice plantation agriculture. I have, been to Arizona many times. I'm sure some of you guys have been out there. It's very dry and arid, so you're not going to have plantations and thousands of slaves there. So the Compromise of 1850, California enters as a free state, all right? And the territories acquired from Mexico are going to be allowed to decide on their own, okay? They're going to vote. themselves as to whether or not they're going to be slave states. There's not a lot of problem with that because there's not a lot of people interested in taking slavery there. But this idea of deciding on their own, which is called popular sovereignty, and I'll explain that more in a moment. This idea of deciding on their own is going to be difficult down the road when we get to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So in 1854, we get the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and this is to determine if the Kansas and Nebraska territories are going to be free or slave states. Well, here's the thing. Nebraska, not a lot of issues. It's kind of cold. There's not a lot of interest there. But this territory right here, Kansas, is going to be the focal point of the fight to either be free or slave. You've got a slave state, Missouri, right next door that really wants Kansas to be a slave state. You have lots of people that are interested in taking their slaves to Kansas. You have lots of people that don't want to see slavery spread to Kansas. So we are going to see things degenerate into chaos in Kansas. It's going to be ugly. They said, guess what? We'll just do it democratically. Kansas and Nebraska will vote. Popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty. They'll vote on it. They basically will decide on their own. Guess what? It doesn't happen. They just start killing each other. There's bloody fighting in Kansas as pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces fight it out. It was so bloody they called it Bleeding Kansas. It's during this time that we see the birth of the Republican Party, which was created to oppose slavery. Let's look a little closer at Bleeding Kansas. This occurred on the Senate floor. All right, this is Sumner and Brooks. All right, Preston Brooks is caning Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate. Basically, Preston Brooks is a pro-slavery senator. He was so angry at some things that Sumner said that he ran across to Sumner, who was sitting under a desk, sitting behind a desk, and started to beat him on the head with a gold-tipped cane. And this was a very violent beating. One of Preston Brooks' colleagues held the rest of Congress, held the rest of the Senate at gunpoint to keep them from intervening. So imagine if today one senator pulled out a gun and pointed at everybody else, while a second senator beat a third one half to death. You would be like, man, things are not good in the United States. So there's blood on the floor of Kansas, or blood on the floor of the Senate, and in Kansas, blood is being spilled as well. This is John Brown, and John Brown hated slavery. And a lot of people hated slavery. There were a lot of abolitionists. John Brown hated it in a different kind of visceral kind of way. He had 14 sons. All right, he went out to the Kansas territory and orchestrated what was called the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. So essentially, he and his followers went out at night, and they would capture slave owners from their cabins, and then they took them down to Pottawatomie Creek and chopped their heads off with broadswords and then put the bodies in the creek. So this is why they called it Bleeding Kansas. And then John Brown sort of escaped into the countryside, and he was like the boogeyman for slave owners. They could not catch the guy. He was old at the time, too. They couldn't pin him down. He ends up leading a raid here at Harper's Ferry, where he takes a number of people, some escaped slaves and a group of his sons, and they seize the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. His plan is to steal all the weapons from Harper's Ferry, arm slaves at the surrounding plantations, and start a revolution in the South. They end up getting trapped inside of the arsenal. All right, John Brown gets wounded. All right, and as he's laying there bleeding, and when he's captured, he's eventually taken and executed. Virginia executes him. And at the gallows in 1859, John Brown says, I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of the guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. He was right. By crimes of the guilty land, he means slavery, and by purge, he means getting rid of slavery, and he's absolutely right. At this point, in 1859, there's no way for us to get rid of slavery. but to spill blood, as in the Civil War. All right. The nature of the Union is the final sectional disagreement. South Carolina argued at the South Carolina Exposition and Protest that states were sovereign. Sovereign means that they're basically independent, that a state in the United States can do what it wants. It doesn't have to listen to the national government. And they even argued that they could nullify means cancel or void. All right, they said we can nullify acts of Congress, including the tariff of 1832. Remember I told you the South hates tariffs. The South hates tariffs because they make finished goods more expensive, and the South doesn't manufacture things at the time. So they said we can nullify the tariff of 1832. This resulted in a nullification crisis. If South Carolina, that should say SC, can nullify one act of Congress, they can nullify any act of Congress. They can completely ignore the federal government. They can even leave the Union. Guys, if South Carolina can do this, then we basically might as well rip the Constitution up and throw it out of the window and go back to the Articles of Confederation. Remember in our earlier lecture, I told you the reason we got rid of the Articles was because we needed a government that bound us together as a nation. If South Carolina can do this, we don't have a nation. So even though Jackson is a conservative president and is for states' rights, he has to threaten to send federal troops to get South Carolina to fall in line. This is a sign of things to come. After the election of Abraham Lincoln, South Carolina is going to lead the way in seceding from the Union to preserve slavery. Okay, so the process and the result, these are the slave states in 1789. Remember that we compromised, those territorial compromises with the Louisiana Territory, with the Mexican Cession, and we'll go back over those. Ultimately, all of these tensions between North and South result in civil war. Sectional disagreements over tariffs, the extension of slavery into the territories, and the nature of the Union, states' rights, are going to result in civil war. It all has to do with slavery. States' rights to what? Own slaves. Why did the South hate tariffs? Because their whole economy was based on slave labor. All right? Slavery in the territories. Guys, don't let anybody twist this for you. The Civil War was about slavery, and slavery was the divisive issue. Okay? And it all boils down to that. Northern abolitionists versus Southern defenders of slavery. Don't forget about Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. The United States Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case, remember they said slaves and former slaves can't be citizens, and the federal government can't regulate slavery in the territories. And the failed compromises, the Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which, by the way, the Dred Scott decision invalidated all of those. And don't forget about the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed Southern slave owners to go into the North and capture escaped slaves, and even force Northerners who were opposed to slavery to help them do that. Guess what? Sometimes they kidnap people who were never even slaves. They would just come up into a northern town, find a person who fit the description, and say, "You're the escaped slave I'm looking for." And a lot of times that person was somebody that had never even been in the South. So free black people were being kidnapped into slavery. This was a horrific thing that was happening. And it's just going to further divide North and South. All right, guys, that concludes our SOL 6 lecture. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. All right, make sure that you do the discussion board. Make sure that you read the narrative and answer the questions. Okay, and make sure you do those guided notes.